All right, last week we were talking about stage 2 here. So let's go and recap just a little bit all the way back to week 1 of the month. We were talking about the beginning of chapter 2 in Romans and how we were seeing Paul speaking to these Jews, and they were, pointing the finger at this person and pointing the finger at that person, but they weren't really coming to grips with that they had the same kind of issues, right? And so we were talking about defense mechanisms and all the different ways that mankind has been able to, avoid responsibility in our own mind and put that off on this reason or the other thing. So we're talking about defense mechanisms and how that is not a place where we should be operating as Christians, right? Because it robs us of our opportunity to grow. It makes us want to escape those situations that call us to be better. So that's where we were at with that. And then we were talking about the next time, once you get past those defense mechanisms, like a sort of internal discernment going on, right? Where you're faced with these choices once you get to the point where you really realize that you need to make a choice, and you bring yourself to the point where you can weigh your different options and think about the fact that there are more options that you probably haven't thought about, and it takes a little bit of effort to draw out those things that are the more righteous choices. And a lot of people don't really ever get to that point. They just pick the first thing that seems relatively good and easy, but that's not who we are, right? We want to be the best reflection of Christ that we can be. In this next section here, we see the next sort of the consequences of that situation when people don't do that, and then a little bit of follow through. So let's read Romans chapter 2, starting verse 12. When the Gentiles sin, they will be destroyed, even though they never had God's written law. And the Jews who do have God's law will be judged by the law when they fail to obey it. For merely listening to the law doesn't make us right with God. It's obeying the law that makes us right in His sight. Even Gentiles who don't have God's written law show that they know His law when they instinctively obey it, even without having heard it. They demonstrate that God's law is written in their hearts, for their own conscience and thoughts either accuse them or they tell them that they're right. And this is the message I proclaim, that the day is coming when God, through Christ Jesus, will judge everyone's secret life. You who call yourselves Jews are relying on God's law, and you boast about your special relationship with Him. You know what He wants, you know what's right because you've been taught the law. You are convinced that you're a guide for the blind and a light for people who are lost in darkness. You think you can instruct the ignorant and teach children the ways of God, for you're certain that God's law gives you complete knowledge and truth. Well then, if you teach others, why don't you teach yourself? You tell others not to steal, but do you steal? You say it's wrong to commit adultery, but do you commit adultery? You condemn idolatry, but you use items stolen from pagan temples. You are so proud of knowing the law, but you dishonor God by breaking it. No wonder the scriptures say the Gentiles blaspheme the name of God because of you. In our little glass house lives, as everybody is, we're all observed by everybody around us. These things that we've been talking about the last couple weeks have some really negative consequences when we fail to own up to what we're called to do by God's word here. We have to make sure that we follow our own advice, like we were talking about. Follow our own advice, follow our own conscience, follow the standards that we're given in God's truth, so that we can live with a correct and a cohesive worldview, like we've talked about so many times. And that's sort of what we're seeing here. And we need to support that with a stable, philosophical understanding for our lives here. That's what Paul's sort of getting at as he's talking about these things. He's talking about worldview. You say you know those things, but do you do those things? And people can see those things. And what did Paul say happens when you don't have those things line up with each other? It was like the last line What was the consequence of that? What? Yeah, people talk bad. People blaspheme the name of God. They don't take him seriously. They don't understand him for who he really is, because his people don't do, their values and their actions don't match up with each other. And though they're holding one standard consciously, there are things that they're doing that is not the same way. So, the main thing, the first thing, and which is what this year is focusing on, right, is education. So, in order to be able to do something, you have to first know about it, right? First of all, time out from message. Kids, we were talking about this at Eldership Retreat. What I want you to listen for, so Jeremiah, Molly, Sophia, Aiden, Madeline, did I miss anybody? Oliver? Oh, the kids back there, okay. So listen for the word education, right? Listen for the word education as we're talking about it, and pay attention at those spots, because that's what we're here to do. That's what we're here to learn from God's word, is to educate ourselves. So if you're taking notes, Aiden, Madeline, Molly, if you guys are taking notes and you hear the word education, pay attention and see what's being said, and see if you can take some notes on it and remember what we're talking about, and remember what God says about how we need to be educated. Okay? We need to educate ourselves. That's the first step in this situation. And obviously, we're talking about actions here. You need to do those things that you're supposed to do. And if you don't do those things that you know that you're supposed to do, then people see that difference and they think poorly about God, and they think poorly about us who are representing God. And we have these people here, the Jews, that Paul is calling to task. He says that you are convinced that you're a guide for the blind and a light for people who are lost in darkness. Seeing how we relate to it, we are essentially these people, right? There's this group of Jews who grew up knowing God. They know, they're the experts on God. They are the guide for the blind and a light for people who are lost in darkness. They're surrounded by people in, the Greco-Roman culture that don't understand our God. They didn't understand their God. They are the experts. In our situation, that's us, especially in this particular environment. We're those people. We have that special relationship with God, and we're speaking to the people as we live out our lives. Paul is not speaking to just leaders here. He's speaking to the general population, right? He's writing to the church. It's not like, Timothy, where he's speaking to his confidant in leadership. He's speaking to these people, and he's like, you normal people, you need to be educated. You need to understand what's being pursued here. It's not the top-of-the-line people. It's every single person that has this responsibility. And he calls into question our ability to be an example, to lead, also known as educating people around us. So we're informing the population. He's calling into question our ability to do that. So we should call into question our ability to do that and see where we're at. He says, blind guides, radiating light of God for others to follow. These words of being blind guides and radiating light. The radiating light thing is kind of what you would think. It's specifically a light of God, of Christ, something that people are drawn to and that is supposed to lead them. And the blind guides thing, that is an interesting one because it's pretty much exclusively used, this concept of guiding is exclusively used as a thing as in spots where people are doing a poor job at guiding people. So one of those spots is in Matthew, where he says, blind guides, he's talking to the Pharisees. Jesus is talking to the Pharisees. You strain your water so you won't accidentally swallow a gnat, but you swallow a camel. They're looking at the microscopic picture of things, not to, worried about swallowing a little tiny bug. But then they're missing the big picture of that, and they're actually eating a camel while they're trying to avoid eating their little gnats. The other thing that was an interesting spot that really stood out to me was in Acts 1, where Luke says, brothers, the scriptures had to be fulfilled concerning Judas, who guided those who arrested Jesus. That guided word, it doesn't say blind guide there, but that's the same exact word that's used in all of those other situations. And it just so happens that it's talking about Judas, the person who guided all the Roman soldiers to come arrest Jesus, like, one of the worst, if not the worst mistake in human history, the worst act of guidance. He was guiding these people to arrest the best man that ever lived for doing something that he didn't do. And that is the picture that we're painting here in terms of being a poor guide. We obviously don't want to be poor guides, right? We want to be really super, crocodile, what's the dude's name? Steve Irwin. We want to be Steve Irwin guides and be super awesome like that. And as Josh talked about last month, in order to do that, we want to achieve that sort of mastery, to educate our people in a way that is authoritative and gives back to them. It has an outworking for it. In John 15, we see that Christ says, when you produce much fruit, you are my disciples. And so I want to take a second and ask that question. What do you think about your fruit? What do you think about your crop? Is God impressed with your crop as you're guiding people and, essentially putting yourself in that position of people potentially looking at you and following you as disciples follow their leader? Is God impressed with the results of that yet? And where are you? Just give an honest thought about that. I'm not satisfied, for the record, so I'm really interested. Instead of being confident, a confident leader and a focused leader and convinced of our ability to teach like these Jews were, Paul paints a picture of these people as, they're owning their position. They're like, yes, I'm a leader. I'm doing this. This is who I am. These people need to follow me because I'm a light. I am the Christian. These people don't know God, but I know God, and so they can look at me. He looks at that and says, you might be getting a little ahead of yourself. We need to push for mastery over ourselves as priority number one. And that's what these Jews were missing out on. They weren't doing that. They weren't making sure as their first priority that they were aligned with all these things and teaching and living exactly how they were supposed to be. But it's foundational, and we can't really achieve anything. We can't achieve a stable structure without focusing 100% on that foundation and making sure that foundation is still good. That's, you can have the most beautiful building in the world, like Venice, for example, but the foundation is toast. Like, it's sinking, and it won't exist in X number of years, and there's nothing that we can really do about it. Instead, we need to maintain that foundation and keep our focus on that 100%. Keep our focus on educating ourselves about God's design and about God's plan for how everything is supposed to look above everything else. He doesn't say, you notice, that the elders, that you need to pay attention to the elders and it's their responsibility to teach you about all of these things, although they did do that and it's right for them to do that. But he's not saying, go make sure other people are teaching you. He's saying, this is your responsibility, you general population of people. This is your responsibility to make this happen, to educate yourselves so that you aren't a blind guide leading the blind. in terms of the teaching learning model, the teaching learning pattern, I suppose. I just want to look at that really quick and what that looks like, and see if, draw into question how our normal outlook on educating ourselves look. Because regardless of if you're in cadre, or if you're in the public school system, or if you're the person going to trade school or whatever, the process for the most part looks the same. You study, and then you practice what you studied, and then you study some more, and then you do some sort of practice test, right? That you're in this safe position where you're being tested, but say with safe people, for example, like within the church body or under your journeyman, where a person is looking out for you. And then you study some more, and then you have an actual test somewhere. In the education system, that's this official thing, but in life, that's just an event shows up and you need to solve it, and it's on you to solve that, and that's your real test. But there are all these steps that come before that about study. What do you think we need to study? Yeah, we need to study the Word of God. That's our main text here. And practice, put that into practice in different ministries and so on and so forth. And then study some more, see where you can improve. But the point is that your own self-mastery is your number one priority. And everything else will naturally follow that. Because once you get all of that education and all of that mastery over something, when you're in the right place, when you're looking to give back to the body as a natural flow of things instead of making your such valuable gifts and whatever the priority, it will naturally flow. When you have stuff to give, people will even come to you for help with that. And that's the situation that we want to be in, is where we've developed that mastery, but we're not looking to give back. Just to give sort of a practical example of that, I feel like Kevin was a decent example of that, where you have somebody that is not really willing to put in the mastery of something, but wants to give back really badly. And yeah, it's maybe there is a really good heart in there, but the thing that's given back is weak. It has chinks in its armor. It's not consistent. Instead of building it up to the point where you are a master of it, and then people can naturally come and you can naturally give without really having to pay so much attention to whether or not you're giving, because you have enough to give and you can't contain that. We have to just naturally allow those values and ideals, which are God's ideals, to manifest, to bring themselves to life in our own light and bear that visible fruit that we're supposed to have. But if we're not tenacious, if we're not active and aggressive in our own education, in our own mastery of things, if we're not trying really hard to educate ourselves, we see bad consequences bear from that. And that's what Paul is talking about. He's talking about leading without really knowing where the path leads. So maybe it's because I like outdoor stuff and it's really fun, but I think the path is a really good sort of illustration of what we're talking about here. You have a blind guide leading the blind, but we're talking relative here, because yes, maybe you do know a little bit more than the actual blind person. But in terms of the path situation, you're walking two people on a path. One of them is blind. Well, the not blind person can help that person stay on the path. But do they really know where that path is leading? Do they know where that path is in the big picture of the forest? Yeah, they can stay on the path all day. Even if it's dark outside, you can generally stay on a path. You like look up, you see that there's no trees above you. You're like, okay, this is where the path is. It goes kind of this way, and you hit a bush and you recorrect, and you can see a little bit, so on and so forth. But you don't have to stay on a path. You don't have to stay on the right path. You don't have to take the right angles at it. You can not know where it's going and end up somewhere really bad and not know it until you get there. And then you have all this backtracking to do and all these consequences that come with it. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here, is not being on the correct path and trying to lead other people down that. And because of it, like in verse 24 at the very end there, the Gentiles blasphemed God because of it. They talked smack about God because the Jews' relationship with God was not on the same path. They get on this path, they go for a while, and then they're like, I'm on the wrong path. And they're trying to lead other people doing that, but they weren't really going the right direction. They were also, disloyal in terms of the idolatry thing, and that's true. And it seems really black and white to us, but we've talked many, many times, right, about idolatry, about how that is just anything taking the place of God as first in your life. So whether that's, money, whether that's your family or whatever, or your super cool dog that you've invested everything into, or your, me time on Sunday mornings, like reading the newspaper. Whatever it is, all those things are idolatry, and they're not necessarily as black and white as it sometimes sounds. So we have to really pay attention. God was a joke to the people around the Jews, and I think we have to be really careful because people in our time very much think of God as a joke. Like they literally laugh at it, scoff, And so that's why we have to pay attention and make sure that all of our ducks line up in the way that they're supposed to. We have to make sure that what we're thinking and what we're doing are the same, so that people take us seriously and take God seriously. Like if James says that we should invest in CenturyLink, he tells Bishop, look, I got this intel. CenturyLink is the best internet. You should invest in that. You should dump all your money into CenturyLink. But then James doesn't invest his money in CenturyLink. Are you going to feel comfortable with that? Or is that going to be a joke to you? And you're not going to follow through with that. You're not going to take that stand for CenturyLink with any sort of seriousness. Or relay teams. Say, not Justine, but say somebody else does the relay team next year. And say Wendy sets up the relay team. And it's looking really cool. And James says, I want you, he says to each one of you guys, you should be on, privately so nobody knows, but you should be on Jen's team. Jen's team is going to be the best team, and everybody should try to get on Jen's team. But then, James sneaks over and he joins Michaela's team. You're like, wait a minute, something doesn't make sense there. Maybe I want to be on Michaela's team. Because Michaela's got like an ace up her sleeve or something. She's got something going on there. But anyway, if the two things don't match up, then you can't take it seriously. And nobody is taking God seriously. And what we're talking about here is not so much anymore like a one-for-one. Like, you steal, or you say don't steal, but do you steal? That's an obvious one. But then we start seeing Paul talking about something a little bit different. He starts talking about idolatry. He says, you condemn idolatry, but then do you use items stolen from pagan temples? It's not really a one-for-one there. Now we're talking about sort of philosophical progression here. We're not talking about just plain actions. And we're getting bigger and bigger. Paul's getting a little deeper here. So let's take a look at another spot in Matthew 23, verse 16. Let's see where we are here. Matthew 23, verse 16 through 22. Blind guides once again. What sorrow awaits you, for you say that it means nothing to swear by God's temple, but that it's binding to swear by the gold in the temple. Blind fools, what's more important, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? And you say that to swear by the altar is not binding, but to swear by the gifts on the altar is binding. How blind, for which is more important, the gift on the altar or the altar that makes the gift sacred? When you swear by the altar, you're swearing by it and by everything on it. And when you swear by the temple, you're swearing by it and by God who lives in it. And when you swear by heaven, you are swearing by the throne of God and by God who sits on the throne. Once again, we're talking about these things that are getting a little bit more philosophical up in here. We're talking about gifts in gold. People are trying to swear by gifts in gold, which are the practical, the tangible values, right? They're the things that people look at and they're like, oh yeah, that's valuable. But then Jesus is saying, why don't you swear by the altar and the temple, the philosophical things that actually hold the value, that actually generate value, they're the things that give real meaning to things. It's like, kind of like the whole concept of giving a fish to a person versus teaching a person how to fish. It's like, one thing, yeah, there's immediate value there, but are you going to swear on the idea that you have a fish, that you have a piece of gold, or are you going to swear on the idea that you have a way to generate an infinite amount of value, something that far outweighs and transcends the type of value that we're capable of generating ourselves? But they weren't able to discern that, right? They weren't like educated enough. They didn't understand what that really means to be swearing by something, to call on the value, the intrinsic value rooted in God of something. And that sort of translates into our normal lives, right? Into our actions. So let's say Devin and Willie are going to hang out. They're going to go chill. But Devin forgets to text Willie back. That's lame, Devin. That's lame. But you can say to yourself, you know, it's like 9 p.m. You're like, oh, there's no way we can hang out tonight. Oh, well. And that is what it is. Like, that's the practical value of that. But that's not really what that means, does it? Because if Devin doesn't text you back, Willie, what does that say to you? What does it say? What's Devin doing? Yeah, he's being lame. But in a more articulate, educated way, what he's saying is that he doesn't really respect that time that you were hanging out, that you had set aside to hang out. He doesn't really respect your relationship. Don't worry, I'm not saying this is true. I'm sure you guys have a great relationship, however small it is right now. But that's the situation, is, you know, even if it is too late, you have to respect that aspect of communication. You have to respect that aspect of repentance, right? Hey man, I'm really sorry. I totally dropped the ball on that. I didn't text you back, and you know, I really want to hang out again though, like some other time. Let's make this happen, and maybe this time I won't mess up. I'm sorry. It does matter, and God says it matters. And when you look at things that way, it enables so much more grace and the character of God to be shown in that, in a way that people can't laugh at, because it has substance, it has meaning, it has value to it, because at its root, that's what's up, the philosophy of it. The implications of our actions show like almost 100% of our relationship with God, right? How often in a conversation do you literally bring up God? It's like very little, right? There's certain people more than others. Like a bishop brings up God like 10 times more than any of the rest of us, because he's like, you know, hardcore and loves doing that, and that's awesome. But a lot of us, you know, it's like less than 1% of our communication is God, but the rest of it is communicating something all the time. The rest of it is like implied conclusions about where we're coming from as people. Every single person does it, because people are just philosophical in nature, right? We just are. Even if you're not a philosophical person, you're philosophical in nature. And we can see that when we look at kids, right? Like, can we say that a kid's education is valuable with our words, but then we don't want to help them with their homework? Does that make any sense? That kid's going to grow up not really understanding necessarily, not be able to like spit back at you what that means, but they're going to grow up thinking that education is not worth it. Like, my parent doesn't even care that I'm doing my homework. Why should I care if I, do good in school? Why should I care if I do anything like that? Like, it doesn't have value to it, clearly, because the person that's telling me that it has value doesn't actually believe that it has value. Love is the same kind of thing. If you tell a person that they're loved, but then you treat them terribly, like, that doesn't work. And even like with infants, in how you can like hold a baby and you set the tone for that. They like respond to your physiology even. Like, you're acting and holding yourself with a particular philosophy. Like, what does that mean in your feelings about things? And yeah, your relationship with God as your kid is like freaking out or whatever reflects even to them when they're a little baby, and they can be more calm or less calm based on where you're coming from, what it means to be in interaction with them, even at like the tiniest age. And it should be noted that when you violate that, when you say one thing but your philosophy doesn't line up, then it makes bitterness, right? It makes bitterness. It makes people angry at you. It makes people then, in the long-term philosophical sense, angry at God in that, because they still can't see that. Or you could take like a known liar, for example. Like, nobody trusts a known liar, even when what they're saying seems to make sense. Like, you still hold back a little bit. You're like, what you're saying makes sense, but what I have seen to be true about where you're coming from is that you were false. You're, a person that can't be trusted. That's a philosophical jump about the implications of how a person is acting. And that's how we are about every little thing that we do every day before every person. And then there's, some of the less obvious ones, like, and common ones, like, having a clean house when people are over, like the hospitality aspect of that. Scripture calls us to be hospitable. And that type of thing reflects all those different things that we talked about with the like texting, respect and consideration and putting other people first before that and wanting to provide for them. All of those are qualities that God shows and that God's people should show. And then the ultimate one is like love under persecution. Like, that kind of thing shows that we're not of this world. Where we're coming from is not in this world, and that we trust someone that has power over death, has power over pain. And those things don't come philosophically from anything that is small enough to fit in this world. And we have to think about that on the daily basis, about what exactly all of our little actions are meaning. Now, it's not just that we need to understand effects, because we're called to serve people. We need to understand effects because that's the base understanding of it. That's the base education that we need to have. But we also need to see the needs of our people, right? And the needs of those people that are in need of ministering to. So when you look at a person's life, can you see philosophy in that? Can you see what their life means? Can you see what other people's lives are meaning toward them? Like philosophies that other people are putting onto them. The easy vision of that is parents putting, a certain philosophy onto their kids. But can we see those things? They may not be able to process what's happening to them. I look at, my partner at work, or, John looks at his teammates, or you guys, when you're going to the farmer's market, like, you have a relationship with your farmer. Like, all these people, sometimes they can't process what exactly that philosophy is, what that worldview is that they're being exposed to, but we can. And the reason for that is because God holds a big enough philosophy. He allows us to have a big enough worldview that all of these little fractured views of things can fit into it, but they can't necessarily comprehend the bigger picture that goes beyond that as well as we can. We have the skill, we have the equipment to be able to do that. And we should seek to understand that. It's God's design and in his image that we're philosophical in that way. And I think going back to the whole kids thing, it makes it really clear that there is a need out there. For example, with kids, just talking about the nature, the philosophical nature of us and the nature of their need. It's like when you have a physically abused or emotionally abused or sexually abused kid, they can be so young that they can't even understand the implications of those things. But for whatever reason, it still affects them on a real level. It has meaning to them. You can grow up being abused in one way or another or always to the point where you expect to be abused like that for your whole life because that's what you've been taught, and you even look for that. When you look for your husband or look for your wife, you look for that abuse because that's what's been taught to you is loving, But you have to ask, why is it that those things still hurt a person, Even if a person expects and seeks that type of poor treatment, they're still hurt by it every single time. And the reason why is because the image of God is being violated in that. There is a need, even if a person can't even understand their own need. And that's a really sad situation. So we should equip ourselves for the big picture of things, for that. How to educate ourselves properly and stay on not just the path leading a person, but staying on the correct path, going to the correct spot. And to know that, we have to be able to see the map of where all these paths are leading. So we have to be able to discern those implications of how a person is operating. And what that looks like is to educate ourselves in philosophy, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the nature of where something is coming from. There's lots of practical worldviews out there, Rose was talking about the behaviorist helping her mom. That's one of those practical worldviews where everything it's like psychology, where you base everything just on action, reward, and basically a reward system to encourage people to do the right things. And those are really, really effective in certain situations, like the one with Mama, where that's what people need. But a lot of people try to take that behaviorist philosophy and apply it to everything, to apply it to people that don't need that. And what that does is it reduces people down to a machine that they're not, you're not motivated. Bishop is not motivated by solely a reward system. If I give Bishop a piece of bacon every time he does something good, that's not going to make him feel good inside. That's not going to make him feel valued. That's going to make him feel like a dog. And that's what that system does, but it works really well for certain people and certain needs. And that's how a lot of different things are. But we have to understand that that's not for everybody. And the only philosophy that works for everybody is God's big philosophy that can hold all of those things, that can hold the fact that he is, a personal, creative, philosophical God that loves each person as an individual and values our participation in the group and so on and so forth, and values all these communications in very particular ways. But in order to be able to tell that, we have to understand a lot of different philosophies, or at least the main groups of them. Whether a philosophy is reducing everything down to just a little piece of insignificant nothing and treating you like a machine or like an animal or whatever, or if the philosophy is poofing up really big and value is in every little thing, and so therefore nobody really has a significant and personal value. Like generally the philosophies either fall into one of those two things, or God reserves a unique philosophy for himself that he doesn't let anybody else take. So that's the one that we need to understand so that we can understand all of the rest of them. But as we're going about and studying these things, we should look at that. We just talked about like the practical aspect of things, like the behaviorism, especially in the United States where everything is like, I want this now, I want this now. So there's lots of philosophies out there, right, that are like getting based, like make sure you have yourself taken care of, make sure you have an excess of this, make sure, yada, 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 not really talking about the meaning behind things, the value of things. So we should pay attention to that in particular. Like if there's any approach that you're taking to something that ends up leading to an excess, right? Or ends up leading to you saying, oh yeah, I'll be set if I just do this and I won't have to worry about it anymore. Like those are not parts of God's design. God's design is for us to be active in our maintenance of our education and our lives and that. So we don't want to be able to just set something aside and let it go on autopilot, because at that point it goes off course, right? It's an improper philosophy. But things look so good in the moment that you forget about that sometimes. You're like, oh yeah, that sounds great. Like I really want to set aside, X amount of dollars for my retirement, and so when I get to be an old person, I'm going to have $2 million in my retirement fund or whatever. I don't even know what's the appropriate amount to have in your retirement fund, but whatever. You know what I mean? Like, yes, I'll be set. I won't have to worry about that at all. I'll have an excess where, I'll be totally good, won't have to worry about it at all. But in that, are you neglecting something that is needed in the now? Because what we do now stores up treasures in heaven, not stores up treasures in a bank account that can be taken by a economic collapse or you dying before you even get to retirement or whatever, Like, are you taking care of things that need to be taken now based on the meaning, the philosophy of what's happening in the now? Or are you saving up things according to a practical worldview where you're going to have excess later, where you're going to have to not worry about it? So on and so forth. I don't know where I came up with this, but I came up with a little tiny slogan: no struggle, no spirit. I don't know what that is, but I like it for the most part. I haven't fully analyzed the philosophical meaning of it, So I'm not going to put it in pen yet. But we need to be looking for what the meaning of things are. So let's read from Isaiah, the suffering servant passage, part of that. Isaiah 53, verse 9. He had done no wrong and never deceived anyone, but he was buried like a criminal. He was put in a rich man's grave, but it was the Lord's good plan to crush him and cause him grief. Yet, when his life made an offering to sin, he will have many. Yet, when his life is made an offering for sin, he will have many descendants. He will enjoy a long life, and the Lord's good plan will prosper in his hands. So this thing, there's not a practical emphasis to it. There's a lot of sacrifice. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of, negative presence in there. But the philosophical point is sacrifice. It's finding out what a person needs and being able to see where their value is and where their difficulty is, and being able to provide a solution for them, which is part of God's design of things, not a quick, practical solution, but a solution that really gives credence to the value of a person. It just so happens that it's also practical in that it relieves the sin of a person, because God is super clever like that. God is a person that can both hold the philosophical meaning of something and accomplish it with the right philosophy and have it be very practical. We can do that too. But the thing is you have to think about it philosophically first and then get creative enough to make it practical. Because what God cares about is the philosophy of where you're coming from, where your heart is coming from, not about, how much of something you have or whatever it is. And we see that submission structure in a couple different places. Just I think about like how Jesus assigns jobs of practicality to his rookie disciples. Like he gives Judas, the person that is least, he knows Judas. He knows Judas, and he knows what Judas is going to betray him in later. He gives him control over the money. Interesting. Christ must care a lot about that money. And he's known, and he was like known for, taking a little off the side and stuff, but he still was in charge of the money. There's that submission structure, philosophy and then practicality. Or the apostles, in turn, took the same sort of pattern where they were getting overwhelmed and couldn't maintain the philosophy of things. And so, what did they do? They gave the practical jobs to deacons, and they invented the position of deacon to make that happen so that they could take care of the more important philosophy of things, dealing with people's value, dealing with the nature of people's needs, and understanding what was going around them so that they could be effective. Like the effectiveness comes in the philosophy of things, and that's why we need to understand it. So, we should definitely work on that, like understanding the map of things instead of just working to stay on a path, because it's not just a path that we need, it's understanding the big picture of the map in how we're building our education to understand the different thought processes. So, let's take a navigation class before we guide an excursion, right? There's so many tools in navigation, it's like insane. If you're going to guide a bunch of people, you better make sure that you're going to guide them not into a ditch or to a military zone or whatever you're doing. So let's make sure to do that and educate ourselves in those philosophies. So a couple questions to think about. How are you dealing with your self-education? It's early in the year still. This year is about education and discernment. How are you dealing with that yet? Are you taking that seriously as a focus this year? And what sort of things do you think you could do that would benefit you? In specific, I want you to think about philosophy, because like I said, including myself, a lot of us are not philosophical in nature, but that is how God operates on a primary basis. So we should give that credence and work on that skill of understanding that. Over the next week, and maybe I'll do that one later when we close. So the other question is, how well can you identify where others are coming from philosophically? I think about the media and about just your friendships and stuff like that. Are you able to look at somebody, like a statement that somebody says, and pick that apart to where you can see, oh, this is where they're putting the value of this, or this is where this leads 5 years from now, or whatever it is that they're saying. Like, how well can you do that? How well can you distinguish the nature of what somebody is saying versus the surface mechanics of it? Okay, let's break and talk about it.